Welcome, everyone, to Prudent Observations. I am your amphibious host on all things politics, culture, and international relations, the Prudentialist. Today, we're beginning to start a new series on the channel and on other platforms. We are going to be reading through and discussing chapter by chapter the great volume of work by historian Sean McMeekin, Stalin's War. And we're going to be discussing that in full. And to talk about the first chapter, Before the Storm, the main currents of Soviet foreign policy, 1917 to 1938, is Mr. Ranging Mandrill. How are you, sir?
Doing well as always. I get to be the simian counterpart to your amphibian uh, uh, hosting here. So I'm excited to get into this. This is an excellent book. Um, and I'd just like to say at the outset, if you thought that you didn't hate FDR enough before reading this book, you really don't. So yes, without further ado, please
Yeah, I
let's get
think of
into
Orrin.
it.
I think of Orrin McIntyre's line, "You don't hate journalists enough," and I'm like, "You don't hate FDR enough. You really
Yeah.
don't." After reading this book, you don't hate FDR enough. Sean McMeekin is probably one of my favorite mainstream historians. He has a really great book on the Russian Revolution. He's done a lot of great work explaining the tragedy in the opening months prior to World War One. He's got a great talk at the National World War One Museum in Kansas City about, it's not the guns of August you should focus on. It's really July 1914. But I can't praise his work enough. I think he's a really great guy, very intelligent. But we're going to get started. So without further ado, World Revolution. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was a state like no other. From its earliest days, the world's first proletarian government defined itself in opposition to the existing capitalist states of the world. By repudiating all of the sovereign treaty and debt obligations of the formerly Tsarist Russia in February 1918, Vladimir Lenin's revolutionary government effectively set itself up as an outlaw, outside or above the entire international system, bound only by its devotion to the global proletariat and world revolution, not to shop-worn bourgeois concepts such as treaties and the rule of law. As Lenin explained with characteristic bluntness in his pamphlet denouncing the now outmoded petty bourgeoisie mentality in May 1918, if war is waged by the proletariat after it has conquered the bourgeoisie in its own country and is waged with the object of strengthening and extending socialism, such a war is legitimate and holy. Under- yeah, I know. Let's go kill all the priests while we're at it with questionable ethnic resentment built in. Understandably, the Western capitalist powers against whom Lenin's vituperation was directed, Britain, France, and the United States, responded in kind to the Bolshevik default, freezing Russian assets abroad and refusing to recognize Lenin's outlaw regime. This subtraction from the international system of what had, before 1914, been one of the world's largest and most dynamic economies would in itself have a profound impact on the financial frailty of the post 1918 world, capping off the economic devastation of the First World War, from damage to infrastructure and trade to debt fueled inflation. Before the October Revolution of 1917, Russia had been allied to these great Western nations, which had been the bulk of its foreign debt, and the Great War that had been bound by the London Convention of September 1914 not to sign a separate peace treaty with the Central Powers, Germany, Austria Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. When Lenin's diplomats signed just such a treaty with the victorious Germans at Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, this provided still more confirmation for the Allies of the lawless nature of Lenin's regime. By sending troops to aid Lenin's opponents in the nascent Russian Civil War, Western allies also provided confirmation for the binary us against them mentality of Bolshevik foreign policy. And as always, man, you'll just stop me whenever you want to talk about something.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, okay. We've seen enough Pete Quinones shows to do this. Of course, despite mutual antipathy between Bolshevik Russia and capitalist powers, the conduct of diplomacy had often had to be tempered by practical considerations. Such was certainly the case of the Brest-Litovsk. I'm not going to be able to pronounce that, guys. If you're going to chew me out in the comments, so be it. Where Lenin had
Brest-Litovsk.
all right, Brest-Litovsk, where Lenin had authorized his diplomats to sign a punitive treaty with Germany and other Central Powers with scarcely concealed contempt for those capitalist regimes. En route to the negotiations, Russians were witnessed throwing propaganda leaflets from the train at German soldiers. To force Lenin's hand, German warplanes even bombed Petrograd in early March 1918, prompting the Commissar of Foreign Affairs, Leon Trotsky, to petition Western allies for help against the invading Germans, first asking France for logistical assistance in relocating the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, then issuing a conditional invitation for British Marines to land in the Arctic port of Murmansk to protect war supplies, and finally broaching the idea soon dropped that British and American officers might help train the new Red Army. The Brest-Litovsk agreement between the early Soviet government and the Central Powers was marked by cynicism on both sides. Despite the confusing twists and turns of early Bolshevik diplomacy necessitated by the weakness of Lenin's regime in 1918, a telltale pattern of Soviet diplomatic practice was emerging. There may have been a temporary convergence of interest between Lenin and the Western Allies after Brest-Litovsk, which led to Trotsky's conditional olive branch to the Allies, but its fundamental hostility between the two sides was revealed as soon as these circumstances had changed. The same was true of relations between Lenin and the Central Powers. Far from being a loyal German agent, as many Allied critics believed because of his acceptance of German funds and the logistical support prior to the October Revolution, Lenin agreed to the German terms at Brest-Litovsk in 1918 only to win time, and he repudiated the terms with perfect impunity as soon as he learned of the German collapse on the Western Front at the end of September of 1918. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty, a German diplomat reported from Moscow on October 10th, is a dead letter. Our influence with the Bolsheviks is completely exhausted. They do with us now what they wish. With Schadenfreude, Bolshevik diplomats celebrated Germany's comeuppance by confiscating German diplomatic bags in Moscow and Petrograd. In the bags, they found and helped themselves to 250 million Tsarist rubles. The
Yeah,
same was. Yeah,
I
go
wonder
for it.
how much that is in today's dollars. I didn't do the calculation before this, but this is going to set a pattern that you'll see with the Reds. And it's very clearly seen, even since the earliest days, that they just kind of help themselves to whatever they want and whatever they like.
Mhm.
This is a big no-no in the diplomatic world. You don't confiscate somebody's, the bags of diplomats, right? You don't subject, if you're trying, especially if you're trying to get international recognition of your ideological state so that you can get access, you don't like seize all of the assets of diplomats. But of course, as they've just mentioned to us, this is a state that has set itself up as an outlaw state and totally rejects any of that sort of diplomatic normality because it's bourgeois. So, it's all baked into the cake, folks.
So, I'm. This isn't accounting for inflation, but since you piqued my curiosity, the Tsarist ruble was backed by gold. That 1 ounce of gold was equal to 5,000 Tsarist rubles. So I calculated daily price of gold per gram in U.S. dollars. So 1 gram of gold is $64. So let's just say
Well,
60.
an ounce of gold now goes for around 2K. It broke 2K a few months back. So you
So
just
we're
calculate.
talking in untold hundreds of millions,
Oh yeah.
if not maybe even I someone will have to do the math, but I mean like in USD this is even much more money in today's cash, and so they outright stole millions, if not billions of dollars. Uh, the same was true for Soviet encouragement of autonomy for national minorities such as Finns, Poles, and Ukrainians. The policy was embodied in a decree of the rights of the peoples of Russia to self-determination signed by Lenin and his nationalist commissar, Joseph Stalin, in November 1917, when the Bolsheviks wished to still break up the Tsarist Empire. Once his government was strong enough, Lenin fought to bring these people back under the Soviet control, and succeeding in the case of Ukraine, although not with Finland, which preserved its independence in the Russian Civil War, or with Poland, which had defeated the Red Army in 1920 and expanded its borders eastward into the Soviet Ukraine, well past the Curzon line endorsed by the Entente powers at Versailles in 1919. The treaty signed with the capitalist powers, such as the Diktat peace imposed by Germany at Brest-Litovsk, were seen as temporary truces, valid so long as they served Soviet interests or when the Soviets were too weak to break them. This was equally true of Soviets' agreements with Western powers, such as Trotsky's invitation for Allied troop landings in March 1918, which was later expunged from memory as the Bolsheviks mythologized a conspiratorial Allied intervention to strangle Lenin's infant regime. As early as June 27th, 1918, Georgy Cherchin, Trotsky's successor to Commissar of Foreign Affairs, issued a formal protest against the invasion of the English armed force at Murmansk, notwithstanding the fact that the English had been invited there by Trotsky as a result of German military occupation of Western Russia. The same pattern of opportunistically playing hostile capitalist factions against each other could be observed in Soviet diplomatic practice after the Allies withdrew from Russia. As Lenin explained to the Party Congress in late November 1920, shortly after the rout of the last white forces in the Russian Civil War, if we are obliged to tolerate such scoundrels as these capitalist thieves, each of whom is preparing to plunge a knife into us, it is our direct duty to make them turn their knives against each other. Thus, the Anglo-Soviet trade agreement, which a Bolshevik team signed in London in March 1921, seemed to signal a long-awaited thaw in relations between Moscow and the victorious Western powers. Keen to open up the Soviet market to English exports of wool and weapons after Britain had sunk into a post-war industrial depression, Prime Minister David Lloyd George had forfeited his leverage up front by refusing to demand repayment of Russian loan and equity obligations that Lenin had repudiated in the 1918 default.
This is the start of the diplomatic pattern that you see with the Soviets, is that the Anglo powers always seem to, at least in this period prior to the Second World War, they give up their leverage from the get-go. They have the Soviets basically over a barrel. They can demand whatever they like and tell them, look, you've defaulted on this obligation. You can't pay this obligation, but we still want to trade with you, so we'll kind of ignore that.
Yeah, you're going to see this play out also in Cold War diplomacy when it comes to finances and trading technical equipment and material, at least when it comes to the UK and Labour governments. But that's a story for another time. Exports were indeed stimulated until the Bolsheviks had spent the last of Tsarist gold bullion they had seized in the revolution, leaving the Soviet government effectively broke. But when the Allies refused to extend to Moscow new loans at a conference in Genoa in April 1922, the Bolsheviks reached a far more favorable deal with Germany at a hotel in nearby Rapallo, in which Berlin extended a credit line to the Soviets while allowing Lenin to repudiate outstanding Western debt claims for good. The Treaty of Rapallo, which had included a secret clause allowing German industrialists to manufacture and test new weapons on Soviet Russian territory, evading the prohibition of German rearmament as imposed by the Versailles Treaty, exacerbated tensions between Germans and the Allies yet again.
Okay, stop. So, just to make this very clear for the audience, right, the Soviets seized a bunch of assets from the Tsarists. They've spent it all by purchasing all of the things from the British that they need. They are now out of money. So they go to the Germans to get loans, which is effectively finding more money, right? It's being lent money. And you'll see what happens later with this. And the Germans kind of, because they are imposed with such strict restrictions by the Treaty of Versailles, they need this, right? They need the ability to do weapons testing out of Germany proper, out of the eyes of, Allied observers and spies and that sort of thing. So this is where you start to get, a German and Russian or German-Soviet cooperation, right? This is the start of this. However, the interesting thing to note is that, as we'll see later, the Soviets can't pay their loan obligations to the Germans either. Eventually, we'll see that eventually, but that's going to have deep consequences, and it makes you wonder exactly how much of these loans for the Treaty of Rapallo were, because they all basically got defaulted on, and the Germans learned firsthand the hard way that, the Soviets will try to play fuck games with you in terms of restructuring loan negotiations. Basically, they just don't want to pay because they don't have the capital to pay. So they'll just delay you and draw it out and draw it out and draw it out and try to get, try to restructure their debt settlement so that you either pay it with a much lower interest rate or that you make the loan a 20 to 25 year loan, basically, which is just insane, right? So, but of course, because this is defaulting, and this is in the early 20s, you can easily imagine with the economic chaos that's going in Germany, how that's going to play out in terms of capital investment and economic downturn, right? If you have a whole bunch of money that's flowing out of the country through by being invested in the Soviet Union, and that money is not bringing in a return, is not bringing in interest, is not even bringing back the principal amount that was loaned in the first place, well, you can easily imagine that might make some economic difficulties, especially at the macro tier of economics.
Yeah, absolutely. And also at the same time, what you see in America is the beginning of what we would call the Roaring Twenties. Um, we have President Harding that has got sort of the American Relief Act for the Soviets right now, or no, it's under Herbert Hoover, excuse me, and he's got the American Relief Administration, and he's trying to. I think he spends like $20 million for Russian Famine Relief Act in 21. All of this gets quickly shut down by 1923 because uh, it wasn't needed. It was discovered that under Lenin they had renewed grain exports, so it didn't matter that these people were killing each other and starving one another. We were just, oh, there's no need for this because the Russians can feed to their own people, so we're not going to bother. And this is where you get to see that it's not until FDR where we get the legal recognition of the Russian state. But like we said, we'll get to the FDR hate later about this book. But if you thought you hated FDR, you don't hate him enough. While many Western statesmen were shocked by such duplicitous Soviet behavior, Lenin never really made it a secret of the ruthless hostility driving communist relations with the outside world. As long as capitalism and socialism exist, he proclaimed at a Moscow Party Congress on November 26, 1920, we cannot live in peace. In the end, one or the other will triumph. A funeral dirge will be sung either over the Soviet Republic or over world capitalism. Prophetic words. The lesson for Soviet foreign policy was clear. Until the final victory of socialism in the whole world, Lenin explained, we must exploit the contradictions and opposition between two imperialist power groups, between two capitalist groups of states, and incite them to attack each other. Soviet statesmen should strive to increase tension between rival coalitions in the capitalist world. A new rift between the Entente and Germany would surely open at some point. No less promising, in Lenin's view, was the future Japanese-American war for capitalist supremacy in the Pacific, for the right to loot. They want to fight. They will fight. In the initial stages of global capitalist war breaking out in Europe or Asia, it would be best for the communists to stay on the sidelines while the belligerents exhausted themselves. As soon as we are strong enough to defeat capitalism as a whole, Lenin vowed, we shall immediately take it by the scruff of its neck.
I mean, that's prophetic. But like I said, the capitalist powers just, they don't get it. They just don't get it. These people want to kill you and you're still giving them resources, right? No, you can't do that. You can't trade with him. This is an outlaw state and they just don't get it.
Yeah, and those words are incredibly prophetic. Whether it's the funeral dirge for the Soviet, the Soviet Empire, or a future Japanese-American war, and I mean, there were even Americans that had predicted this was to come as well. There was a whole fictional novel in the 30s about that coming war. But yeah, I mean, exploit contradictions and force powers against one another. Sound foreign policy for a subversive state. As Lenin's brutal remarks suggest, the true face of Soviet foreign policy was revealed not in the day-to-day activity log of the foreign and trade commissariats, where officials could be as pragmatic as they pleased as long as the agreement signed served short-term Soviet interests, but in the machinations of Third International or Communist International, Comintern, formed in March 1919. Following the lead of Marx's own First International and the better organized yet ultimately ineffectual Second International, which had failed to prevent the outbreak of the imperialist war of 1914-18, the Comintern was explicitly devoted to world revolution and the overthrow of existing capitalist governments. 21 conditions of membership imposed on the national communist parties functioning as sections of the Executive Committee for Communist International, ECCI, in Moscow, divided up party organizations into legal and illegal branches, with the latter functioning as a shadow communist governments ready to take power come the revolution. Condition 2, with the eye on the Bolsheviks' own hostile takeover of the Imperial Russian Army via Lenin's defeatist peace platform in 1917. Condition 4 required communist parties to carry out persistent and systematic propaganda and agitation among the armed forces, and communist nuclei must be formed in every military unit. Another critical condition, number 15, required national communist parties to render selflessly devoted assistance to the USSR and to any future communist governments in its struggle against counter-revolutionary forces, to urge workers to sabotage any efforts by their governments to transport war materials to the Soviet Union's enemies, and to carry on legal or illegal propaganda among the armed forces that are sent to strangle the Workers' Republic. In this way, a dangerous virus was injected into the international system, with political parties in every significant country in the world devoted to routinely sabotaging and ultimately overthrowing their own governments, while in the paid services of a foreign power, the Soviet Union. Making Soviet influence operations still more explosive, the Bolsheviks had inherited Europe's largest gold reserves from the Tsarist regime, until they were ultimately depleted in February 2022 to pay for English wool and high-end military imports, along with a bottomless supply of looted jewelry and diamonds in the vaults of Moscow's Gokran, or treasury of valuables. Although the communist subversion virus remained latent in most countries, most of the time it spread quickly in the ravaged lands of defeated powers in the First World War. It spread to Hungary, where a copycat Soviet regime was installed in 1919 by Bela Kun, a veteran of the Russian Civil War, and to Germany, where communist or communist-inspired uprisings erupted in early 1919 Berlin and in Munich in March 1921, and again in October of 1923. Although these uprisings ultimately failed, they had the important side effect of inspiring a Volksisch nationalist reaction, especially in Bavaria, which culminated in Nazism. In this way, communist subversion of the foreign governments by fueling political extremism on both the left and right drove the dialectical process that, in the Marxist-Leninist view, would lead to the inevitable triumph of communism. As Lenin's Nationalities Commissar Joseph Stalin explained in an important treatise in 1919, the world has definitely and irrevocably split into two camps, the camp of imperialism and the camp of socialism. Over there, their camp are America and Britain, France and Japan, with their capital, armaments, and experienced administrators. Here in our camp are Soviet Russia and the young Soviet republics, and are growing the proletarian revolution in the countries of Europe without capital, without experienced administrators, but on the other hand, with experienced agitators capable of firing the hearts of working people. The struggles between these two camps constitutes the hub of present-day affairs. To the disappointment of Lenin and Stalin, the revolutionary mood in Europe slowly dissipated after the failure of communists' German October and of Hitler's beer hall putsch in November 1923, owing in part to the new arrangement of German war reparation payments, the Dawes Plan, which helped curb hyperinflation plaguing Germany and Central Europe and thereby lessened the appeal of extremist parties and groups. On the bright side, the reduction of international tensions helped make possible a political rapprochement between Moscow and several former Entente powers after the first ever Labour government in Britain, led by Ramsay MacDonald, recognized the Soviet Union in 1924. A move followed swiftly by Italy and later that year by France. Even inside the Soviet Union, the radical maximalist socialist parties of war communism, which abolished all private economic exchange, including the use of money, were abandoned under Lenin's new economic policy in 1921, which allowed the re-legalization of private grain trade, retail, and even small-scale manufacturing. By the mid-1920s, the life and death struggle between the two camps, as Stalin had called them, seemed quiescent, if not abandoned entirely. Yeah, you gotta kind of have to have an economy if you want to run stuff. If you want,
You gotta make money to do things, to buy things.
even commies need money. Who would have guessed? Still, despite the appearance of communist moderation at home and the regularization of diplomatic relations, there was no genuine reconciliation between the Soviet regime and the capitalist governments it was devoted to destroying. Even in Britain, the country that had led the way in normalizing relations with Moscow, first on de facto terms in Lloyd George's Anglo-Soviet trade agreement in March 1921, then in the recognition by MacDonald's Labour government, suspicion of Soviet motives ran high. Neither Lloyd George nor MacDonald had insisted on debt repayment or on a binding commitment not to interfere in domestic British politics as a condition of the deal with Moscow, and their failure to demand such concessions rankled British conservatives. In May 1927, a Tory-led government authorized a raid on the Soviet trade agency Arcos in London, which turned up enough evidence of communist subversion in British politics to justify breaking off diplomatic relations for the next 3 years. Other capitalist powers that had seen the property of their citizens confiscated by the communists, such as the Netherlands, Switzerland, Yugoslavia, and the United States, remained aloof from the USSR, refusing to recognize the Bolsheviks' outlaw regime all through the 1920s.
And this is a pattern that we'll see in many other places, and why getting diplomatic recognition is so important to the Soviets. These guys think like modern day leftists do, right? Everything is a propaganda and an influence opportunity. Oh, you're willing to trade with us? Oh, you'll let our diplomats get, immunity? Okay, great. We're going to use that to do gay ops, basically.
Many such cases.
Many such cases. They do the exact same thing as always. They're not acting any differently to the leftists now. They don't think differently to the leftists now. Just the language has shifted. But the interesting thing about this little episode here is, once again, the same pattern applies later, right? You have a sort of wet liberal or centrist government who doesn't really understand the commies, or in the case of McDonald's Labor government, who's probably very heavily influenced by Marxian style thought, and they're giving the Soviets very easy terms, and they never insist on the Soviets actually paying their debts, neither getting a hard binding agreement on non-interference. So basically getting the Soviets to agree in writing with some sort of enforcement mechanism for not interfering in your domestic politics. So you're basically allowing yourself to be opened up to subversion. And really, this happens so frequently that you have to wonder if this is if they know that this is going on. But anyway.
Yeah, the simple fact of the matter that you have all this diplomatic leverage to really squeeze out concessions, and none of that gets placed in, really does, in my opinion, just there's some naivete, and if not, there is some friendliness to it. I mean, this reminds me of Ryszard Legutko's book, The Demon and Democracy. That's like, he asks the question. He's a Polish guy, but he asks the question, why didn't any of these Soviet guys ever get punished after the fall of the Soviet Union? And they're in politics now as social democrats. And it's like, well, if you take out the whole global Marxism thing, liberals and social democrats aren't all that different from achieving similar goals. And I'd imagine that there were quite a few in labor that found this idea very fascinating, to have something that far to the left. But there's so much to discuss about labor politics in the USSR that unfortunately Mick Meekin doesn't go into enough detail, in my personal opinion. In a sign of intent, Comintern propaganda spent much of 1927 a relatively peaceful and prosperous year, during which it seemed that the miseries of the post-war years had even been overcome in Germany, where voters had lost interest in Nazi and communist extremism, drumming up hysteria about the menacing war danger against the Soviet Union, a war scare used to justify a massive rearmament drive of the first 5-year plan launched in 1928. Without a hint...
Does this not sound eerily familiar?
Yeah, 5-year plan. We're gonna have a war. Oh boy.
Yeah. I mean, we need to reindustrialize. There's war danger with Russia. Oh my gosh. Anyway.
Without a hint of subtlety, the Comintern's propaganda mastermind, a Lenin comrade for wartime Switzerland named Willy Munzenberg, launched a Comintern periodical simply called The Coming War. Nick gets the knockin' jockin'. This belligerent line was wholly to the liking of Joseph Stalin, the nationalities commissar who had emerged after Lenin's death in January 1924 as general secretary of and the dominant figure in the Soviet Communist Party. More cautious in temperament than the mercurial Lenin, a man who had preferred operating in the shadows, Stalin was a born street fighter, a veteran of countless skirmishes and brawls in which he had always come out on top. Although a political animal who, like Lenin, was willing to adjust his policies to evolving circumstances, Stalin was just as certain of his fundamental worldview. Far from abandoning his two camps theory of international relations after the fall of Bela Kun's Hungarian Soviet Republic in August 1919 and the failure of German communists to take power in 1919, 21, and 23, Stalin doubled down in his first major work after Lenin's death, Foundations of Leninism, 1924. You think we'll get Foundations of Leninism from AA anytime soon?
Maybe.
I wonder if he got his idea for Foundations of Writing and such from Foundations of Leninism. This isn't a dig at him. Now I'm just gonna have to ask.
I
Stalin
mean,
and
he notably says that he reads Lenin as a hobby, so probably.
maybe. I'll have to ask him
Probably.
now. Stalin endorsed Lenin's theory of revolutionary defeatism, in which Lenin had predicted that proletarian revolution would occur not because of the inexorable growth of class contradictions, as prophesied in Marx' Das Kapital, but a byproduct of imperialist war, and the first of the countries to be vanquished would be the first to fall. Though a less elegant theoretician than Lenin, Stalin was just as clear-headed about the circumstances that enabled the improbable Bolshevik triumph in 1917. He's not as much of a theory cell, guys. He knows what he's doing. Uh, had the two chief coalitions of capitalist countries not been engaged in mortal combat during the imperialist war in 1917, he wrote in January 1925, had they not been clutching at each other's throats, it is doubtful whether the Soviet power would have survived. The lesson of the lesson for the future of communism was clear. Europe may have been calm in the 1920s, but any Marxist student of history knew that peace between imperialist factions was a precarious one. The losers of the last war, such as Germany, and even the winners, jealous of others' greater winnings, such as Italy and Japan, were smoldering with resentment over the terms imposed by the victors at Versailles. If war breaks out, Stalin told Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1925, we shall not be able to sit with folded arms. We will have to take action, but we shall be the last to do so, and we shall do so in order to throw the decisive weight on the scales, the weight that can turn the scales. And then
Stalin is very good at realpolitik, it seems. He absolutely understands that we need to, if you want to deal with two power blocks that are seemingly against you, the best way to deal with them is to play them off each other. He's absolutely a real politician. He's in that respect, he is kind of a genius, right? He knows what he's doing. He's a street fighter. He's a thug. He knows how the game is played.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He's a far more sharpened political thinker than his predecessor. Stalin makes his mark. Section 2 of Chapter 1. Stalin, born Yosef, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this.
You want me to take this part?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Stalin, born Yosef Vissarionovich Soso Jugashvili in the Georgian village of Gori in 1878, was a man who usually knew what he wanted. He was caricatured by jealous rivals like Trotsky as a bland bureaucrat, a gray blur, or comrade card index. But Stalin was a more interesting personality than this. Materials that became available after the fall of the Soviet Union show the young Stalin to have been intelligent and charismatic, even an accomplished poet who wrote well-regarded verse in his native Georgian under the pen name Sosolo. Although he was short, about 5 feet 5 inches, and his face was flawed by pockmarks, Stalin cut a dashing figure as a Caucasian bandit chieftain whom many women found attractive. Above all, Stalin was ambitious and ruthless, a born Bolshevik in temperament who made his bones by organizing violent Caucasian robberies. Most famously, the Great Tiflis heist of June 1907, when Stalin's gang threw 10 grenades at an armored cash convoy in broad daylight. According to Tsarist secret police, or Okhrana files, 40 were killed and another 50 wounded in Stalin's terrorist spectacular, which impressed Lenin and made Stalin's name in the Bolshevik movement. In the jostling for power that followed Lenin's death in January 1924, Stalin also proved an astute politician. although some Western observers were surprised by the eclipse of the more famous Trotsky, who had been much better liked in European socialist circles than the fanatical Lenin. Yeah, I wonder why. It was less than shocking for Soviet insiders who knew that Trotsky, despite his fame and flamboyance, had little real constituency in the party. Trotsky's CV was impressive, comprising high profile public roles as Commissar of Foreign Affairs and then of War. But he had made little effort to build a network of loyalists in the party, perhaps feeling that he did not need to. Trotsky was also a recent convert to Bolshevism, joining the party only in July 1917. As a perennial exile, he also had less experience in Russian politics than Stalin, who had toiled away inside the country during the war, doing battle with the Tsarist secret police. So Trotsky's a flamboyant and charismatic figure, but Stalin's got the actual street credentials.
Yeah, well, one can do all the thinking and writing and speeching that he wants, but you need someone who's willing to throw the grenades at the police, and Stalin was definitely that guy. But I'll continue on from here. The
Sure.
truth was that Trotsky was something of a dilettante. He was so out of touch with the political currents that he failed to show up for Lenin's funeral in 1924, a catastrophic error that allowed Stalin to reap the reward for organizing the elaborate rite, the embalming of the body, and the cult of personality that turned Lenin into a communist deity, second only to Marx in the pantheon of Marxism-Leninism. By 1925, Trotsky was on the path to oblivion. Owing to his political control of promotions and firings in the party's organizational bureau, Orgbureau, Stalin needed only 2 more years to sideline rivals on the Politburo from Trotsky's left communist allies, Moscow and Leningrad party bosses Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev. To the right of the deviantist Nikolai Bukharin, wanted to abandon Trotsky's doctrine of permanent revolution and grow gradually into socialism in one country. By the end of 1927, Stalin was a supreme general secretary of the Communist Party, if not yet a dictator. With no rivals left, Stalin was now free to realize the promise of Lenin's revolution while putting his own indelible stamp on communism. Addressing the 15th Communist Party Congress in December 1927, Stalin reminded his now cowed comrades that Lenin had never intended his proto-capitalist compromises of the early 1920s to be permanent. The essential question of the Marxist dialectic, Stalin argued, was the who-whom distinction. Who would vanquish whom, socialism or capitalism? To resume the socialist offensive, Stalin proposed a forcible collectivization of agriculture at a Central Committee plenum in July 1928, the first step toward a fully planned socialist economy. Significantly, the primary rationale he had offered up was to secure the USSR against military attack by building up state-controlled grain reserve. A second was to sell grain abroad to finance imports and industrial equipment. In his speech launching the first 5-year plan in November 1928, Stalin thundered, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make up this gap in 10 years. Either we do it or they will crush us." Proceeds to kill millions.
I mean, we just laid out the finances of the Soviet Union, and basically, what is he doing here? He's like, shit, I need more arms, because I can't foster the world revolution if I don't have tanks, if I don't have aircraft, if I don't have machine guns, if I don't have artillery. How do you finance this? Well, obviously slave labor, right? The usual Soviet solution. But also, I need the actual physical capital to sell abroad. And what is the one thing that the Soviet Union has in abundance is actually grain, right? It has incredible amounts of agricultural land. It has the the Black Earth region of the Ukraine and the Donbass and all of that area that's so famous. But he needs a grain reserve, which is interesting, especially now in today's world where you have fuel reserves. But he's also got the need to sell things abroad, right? So he's out of the Tsarist money. He's gone through all of his German loans and he hasn't paid those back. Now he needs to find a way to keep the Soviet state flush with capital. He needs cash, and he needs cash now. So what the decision that he's making here is simply saying, okay, look, I don't care where the grain is coming from. I don't care. And this, of course, is setting up the attack on the kulaks, right, in the Holodomor. But he doesn't care where the grain comes from. He doesn't care where all the agricultural resources come from. He's just saying, I need this resource and I need it now, and I'm not going to wait until I can, get it, even if I'm getting it in greater quantity later. Right? He's like, I need this now because I need the capital to pay off the Western expert industrialists to bring in their stuff and to pay for arms. And that's basically what he's doing here. Is he just needs more money, he needs it now, and he wants it now.
Yeah, by all means. That's definitely what he's a little cash strapped. If you want to continue reading from here.
Sure. The foreign policy corollary of Stalin's forced march to industrialization at home was the new class against class doctrine proclaimed at the Congress of the Comintern in Moscow in summer 1928, which inaugurated the so-called Third Period. After the calm years of the mid-1920s, it was expected that world capitalism would enter a period of heightened contradictions and class struggle, which brought with it new dangers for Soviet Russia, but also new opportunities for communist expansion. As Stalin had argued back in 1926, no matter what our successes, we cannot consider the land of the proletarian dictatorship guaranteed against dangers from without. So, in order to win conclusively, we must bring it about that the present capitalist encirclement is replaced by a socialist encirclement, that the proletariat is victorious in at least several more countries. Only then can our victory be considered final. In policy terms, this meant that communist parties all over the world would adopt a hard left line, supporting constant strikes and organizing militias and paramilitary forces to engage political enemies in street combat. Instead of cooperating with other leftists, communists were expected to denounce Europe's socialist parties, those who had refused to adopt the 21 conditions, as social fascists, even in Germany, where the real fascists were on the scene in the form of Hitler's NSDAP. You can see this is also setting up the lead up to the Spanish Civil War and the Popular Front, right? So there's this, as McMeekin will note in the Popular Front, basically up until the Spanish Civil War, there is this, and the rise of Hitler and Franco, you have this like hard communist left line that won't work with the Social Democrats, and yeah, we'll find out how that works in a minute. The Third Period turned out to be just as turbulent as Stalin had hoped. The onset of a worldwide depression in the wake of the Wall Street crash of October 1929 and a string of bank failures on both sides of the Atlantic in 1931 produced mass unemployment and widespread social misery in the US and Europe. The collapse of demand in the advanced economies, in turn, ruined the economies of the primary producers around the world. In Germany, communist and Nazi paramilitaries battled in the streets when they were not cooperating against the tottering Weimar democratic government, as in several demagogic plebiscite campaigns and the notorious Berlin public transport strike of November 1932. Although, in the short run, the descent of Germany's cities into conditions of virtual civil war helped the Nazis at the polls more than the communists. Stalin...
Who would have guessed?
No, of course not. Stalin continued pushing class against class policies on the logic of the worse the better. The better for communism, that is. Back at home, Stalin's socialist offensive reached its climax just as the capitalist world was succumbing to the Depression. The timing was more than incidental. Stalin's industrialization drive was conceived, sold, and executed like a military operation targeting the capitalist world. As he told the graduates of the new Industrial Academy in Moscow in April 1930, the 50,000 tractors you are going to give the country each year are 50,000 shells blowing up the old bourgeois world. Industry.
I wonder if
can be
he's
converted.
referring to the first the gauze plant or the GAZ. Gorkowski Automobile Zavod, which was helped established by Henry Ford, no less. He made an agreement with the Russians to provide technical aid over the 9 years to building an automobile plant and to help construct Ford Model A and AA trucks. And plus, I'd imagine that there'd be stuff for tractors to be made as well. So just interesting how some of these things kind of come about from foreign investment abroad.
Right. Right, and of course, McMakin gets into that in detail as well later. But the interesting thing in this section is, obviously Stalin thinks very logistically. He thinks, okay, if I can make 50,000 tractors, I can also make 50,000, whatever artillery shells, tanks, etc. Right, industry can be converted for military usage. He understands this very clearly. And he also understands that, well, and this is just where my conspiracy brain starts to work, where you have the Wall Street crash of 29, and like I mentioned before with Germany, this is also the period of the 1920s where a lot of Western industrialists are, lending, as you mentioned, to the Soviet Union, providing technical expertise, giving them money, giving them funding, etc. So Stalin not only is using his grain initiative, he's also receiving foreign funds and aid and investment from the private sector to get more money. But it makes me wonder, right, with the timing of all of this, and especially because, as we'll see later, the Western capitalists really don't get the better end of the bargain on that deal, right? They're making a deal with the devil, literally, and they don't get their money back. So it makes me wonder, like, what, at least from an economist's perspective, what role did the non-repayment of Soviet loans have in creating, the economic conditions of the 30s? Makes you wonder, makes you think.
Yeah, and I mean, like we had said, Stalin and other Soviet leaders kind of know that any sort of deal that you can get with the West is going to benefit you, and it should always serve in your benefit. So, like you said, if you're going to make 50,000 tractors, that now is the industrial plant that can produce 50,000 technicals for any sort of war-making effort, and we're going to see that come into play later on as they engage in fights with the Japanese and others later on in the 30s.
Right. Continuing on. These future industrialists were the shock brigades of the Red Offensive against Capital, foot soldiers in a forced march to socialism, with the targets of each year's march: 17 million tons of pig iron, 170,000 tractors, 200,000 cars and trucks, set, raised, then raised again. The pace of production was never enough for Stalin, who proposed the slogan, 5 years in 4. Whenever onerous production targets went unmet, capitalist saboteurs were blamed as if they had been spies in an enemy camp. Yeah, the Soviet attitude getting very clearly shown here. Stalin's collectivization of Soviet agriculture followed a similar template of military mobilization, but was still more murderous in execution. In January 1930, the Politburo passed a resolution on measures for the elimination of kulak households in districts of comprehensive collectivization. For Ukrainians and others victimized by it, this document has acquired the same notoriety in the history of Soviet famine as the Wannsee Protocols of January 1942 has in the history of the Holocaust. Stalin's intentions in stipulating various categories of kulak, or capitalist peasant households, fit for deportation may not have been as explicitly murderous as the Wannsee Protocols, though many Ukrainians and some historians now believe they were, but the results were unquestionably genocidal. By singling out the most productive peasant smallholders for elimination and confiscating their land and produce, the decree had catastrophic effects on the food situation in Ukraine and other grain-producing areas. From the predictable sabotage resulting from peasants slaughtering horses, cattle, and pigs before they were seized by requisitioners, to the no less predictable collapse in grain yields after millions of Russia's most industrious peasants and their families were deported or simply shot. By the winter of 1932 to 33, a terrible famine had descended on the areas of comprehensive collectivization, affecting more than 70 million people from Ukraine to the North Caucasus to Central Asia. Cannibalism is commonly noted in the Soviet secret police reports from the period. The worst and best known famine occurred in Ukraine, where at least 3 or 4 million starved to death in an epic story of woe remembered by Ukrainians as the Holodomor, translated as hunger extermination. Owing to lack of access to relevant archives, historians are only now reckoning with the catastrophic results elsewhere in the Soviet Union, such as in Kazakhstan, where as many as 1.5 or 2 million Kazakhs starved to death in 1932 and 33. Stalin's collectivization drive destroyed the entire nomadic way of life in Soviet Central Asia, as had been the policy's express intention.
Just
as a welcome,
good God, you know.
I mean, this was intentional. It was deliberate. And as I like to say, when people tell me that, oh, well, it's all just an accident. It just happened. You can't blame anybody. No, policy is not an accident.
So yeah,
Policy is
I'm
deliberate.
gonna go to the footnote real quick. Page 6. The literature on Ukraine, at least now, is substantial. Although he did not enjoy access to Soviet archives, Robert Conquest's pioneering work, "This Harvest of Sorrow: Soviet Collectivization and the Terror Famine," 1986, is still worth reading. And more recent work drawing on the archival documents, Timothy Snyder's "Bloodlands: Europe Between Hitler and Stalin," 2010, is a notable advance, although his slightly lower death figures occasionally protest from Ukrainian scholars and the Ukrainian government. There are now dozens of specialized monographs drawing on this archival document, and many wish to be ably synthesized by Anne Applebaum in a recent work, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. Anne Applebaum, is that who I'm thinking of? I'm opening that in a new tab.
Yeah, that's who you're thinking of, Anne Applebaum.
Oh my God! Yeah, Radoslav Sikorsky's husband. Okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy.
We're not crazy. No.
Yeah, Stalin makes his mark. I think we were.
But anyway, I mean, and it's clear that the Soviets know what's happening because, as McMeekin notes, he's like, look, you've got secret police reports that are saying that there's cannibalism in the region. Like, cannibalism doesn't happen unless there is a extremely severe shortage of food. For people to be willing to break that taboo means that there's literally nothing else for them to eat that's readily available.
Yeah.
So this was deliberate. It was intentional. And as I mentioned before, on a purely value-free power basis, as we in the elite theories pilled circles like to note, Stalin's doing this because I need money, I need capital, because I need industrialization, I need to pay Western experts, Western expertise, and pay Western, just to pay for the basic things in order to make my industrialization drive work, right? And because he's out of money, I need the grain, and the only way that I can get more money to pay off these experts is by exporting the grain. Which makes me, as you mentioned before, the Hoover's policy of providing, the $20 million in aid, that would have all just gone into Stalin's pocket, as everybody notes. You can't offer aid to a dictator because it's not going to make it to the people. It's going to be used for power's purposes.
Yeah, I mean, time and time again, we talk about foreign aid. It's always the same question that gets repeated by others, even in today's politics, or it's just like, look, that money's not going to go to who you think it is. And it's that's the same thing that you see from a lot of and even a contemporary debate over humanitarian aid to Gaza. It's just like, well, who's going to get that money? It's going to be Hamas, so many such cases, I think, with that. A welcome side effect of the mass deportation of the kulaks, Kazakh nomads, and other rural traditionalists from Stalin's perspective was that it furnished an almost bottomless supply of forced labor for his industrialization drive. Thrown together in crowded cattle cars, some marked as white coal or meat, shipped off to labor camps in the Arctic far north of the frigid east of Siberia. Peasants and nomads were fortunate to survive the journey. Many thousands did not. Those who reached Stalin's network of forced labor camps alive were put to work in backbreaking tasks, ill-fed and driven to exhaustion by heavily armed camp guards. The most famous public works project in the USSR, the 155-mile-long White Sea-Baltic Canal of the Moscow Metro, were built by slave labor. Siberian gold fields of Kolma and Chukotka were notorious for the horrendous work conditions. The death rates at Koloma approached 50%. Good God. As an eyewitness observed, a man pushing a wheelbarrow up a high runway would suddenly halt, sway for a moment, fall down, and that was the end. Or a man loading a barrow, prodded by the shouts of a foreman or a guard, would sink into the ground and blood would gush from his mouth. Even free Soviet workers and proletarians, in whose name the communist regime supposedly governed, were bound to their factories by internal passports introduced in 1932. Brutal as labor conditions were in Stalin's merciless planned economic system, the results were encouraging in the material terms, at least. The Siberian gold fields yielded about 100 million rubles per year of ready capital. Great new electric utilities and mining combines soon dotted the landscape of eastern Ukraine, while gigantic tractor and auto factories dominated the industrial suburbs of Moscow, Leningrad, and Chelyabinsk, and a few other cities. Let's see. Magnitogorsk, a planned industrial city near Orenburg, soon housed the largest iron and steel works in the world, employing nearly 250,000 people. Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, recently famous as the last residence of Tsar Nicholas II and his family before the Romanovs were murdered in July 1918, may their memory be eternal, was now better known for housing Uralmash, the world's largest complex for construction and heavy machinery. For the propaganda about building socialism, the truth is that most of Stalin's great new industrial works were modeled on, and in many cases directly imported from, Western capitalist firms, especially American ones. The construction of Stalin's huge iron and steel combines, in theory planned by the State Institute for the Design of Metallurgical Factories, and if Leningrad, or as Petrograd was renamed in 1924, was overseen by Freyan Engineering Company of Chicago, Illinois, hired in May 1927. Magnitogorsk was designed from the top bottom by Arthur G. McKee and Company of Cleveland, Ohio, based on the prototype of a U.S. steel plant in Gary, Indiana. In a similar fashion, American experts from the McDonald Engineering Company of Chicago had overseen the construction of 4 of the world's largest cement combines, one at the Kirk on the Black Sea, 2 outside Moscow, and another just east of the Ural Mountains. The gigantic new hydroelectric plant on the Dnieper River in Ukraine was designed and built by Hugh L. Cooper firm based in New York City. Even sensitive Soviet industries such as copper, gold, lead, zinc, and aluminum mining were dependent on American know-how, with 200 American engineers working in Russia non-ferrous metals production by 1933. The main copper smelting plant in the USSR, the Karabakh Combinat in the Urals, employed 11 Yankee engineers. The Soviet bauxite mining and aluminum smelting industry, critical to the construction of tanks and warplanes, was designed from scratch by American expert Frank E. Dickey, hired from the Alcoa Corporation in 1930, though French aluminum experts were later imported too. Small wonder Soviet Chronicle of the first 5-year plan, the industrialization, was forced to admit in 1933, in a passage later purged from the official accounts from the period, was a combination of American business and science with Bolshevik wisdom that had created these industrial giants in 3 or 4 years. You don't get a modern industrial Soviet Union without American capital and American expertise. And a lot of this, of course, is probably based on we need to make money and they're going to do it and we have the know-how and they'll probably do it whatsoever. But again, I have to ask the question, and this question gets asked throughout the rest of the book, which is this question gets asked throughout the rest of the book. How much of this was naivete and how much of this was just plain old. Oh, you're back again.
I'm back. Yes, I had a minor technical malfunction.
No worries. We were just reading through how much of the Americans helped build the Soviet manufacturing and industrial capability. And I was just saying it raises the important question: how much of this was just I got to make money, and how much of this was sympathy towards their causes, and how much of this was just not knowing what kind of monster they were building up.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because the Colima Goldfields is an interesting thing, and of course, obviously, we talked about the Tsarist gold reserves and all of the diamonds and all of that stuff. Stalin has an interesting point of agreement with Ludwig von Mises. Actually, it seems he actually seems to agree with Mises that gold is the only real money. And you got to remember, this is the age of the gold standard. Everybody still technically thinks of gold as equivalent to money. So, really, this is why Kolyma and Chukotka were so important, and probably why they pushed such an incredibly hard work pace. Because I need gold, because this is the only resource that everybody is willing to trade for, right? If you can pay people in directly in gold, not cash, not paper money, that is a way of avoiding any discussion on what your currency is like. Because remember, you're a Soviet commie. You don't have money. You don't have a paper money. You've abolished it by this point. So, of course, the only resource that you have that you can pay people with is in gold. So, Mises and Stalin actually kind of agreeing here on what the true uh, mechanism for exchanging value actually is. And I do have a footnote because I asked the same question as you did, which is why are Western industrialists so willing to work for the communists? And that my answer is they probably were paid in gold.
Hmm. I mean, that would make, considering how much of American industrialists would later take an anti-war and a more questionable position on things such as, uh, say the Jewish question, or the concern of international communism, as and even being friendly towards Nazism. I can't imagine that this was done with the intent of aiding the Soviets for any sort of war making capability at the time, rather that, hey, we're enjoying the ability to make money, and it's also good to have work in the midst of a great global depression. And if you're going to pay me in gold, by God, I'm going to take gold in a time where the dollar and what FDR is doing with changing things in silver and backing, and later as we would get away from gold. Yeah, I would take gold too over anything else. But let's see here. Yeah. And so ubiquitous were American specialists in Stalin's planned economy that they had their own expatriate newspaper, the Moscow News, whose articles and ads targeted American engineers, specialists, and miners working in the USSR. Even that ubiquitous emblem of Stalinist central planning, the state-run mechanized collective farm, the kolkhoz, inspired by Marx's exportation in the Communist Manifesto to unleash industrial armies in the countryside, was modeled on the American capitalist operation. This was the family farm of one of Thomas D. Campbell, the wheat king of Montana, who happened to own a sprawling estate of 95,000 acres, enough to satisfy Stalin's notion of a mechanized gigantism in the countryside. Campbell visited Soviet Russia on Stalin's invitation both in 1928 and 1930 to teach Soviet collectives the latest techniques in mechanized wheat production. Stalin also resolved to model the evolving Red Air Force on the American aviation technology. So critical was this priority for Stalin, increasingly referred to as Vozid, or leader, he dispatched a massive espionage team of 75 students in summer 1931 to enroll in U.S. universities such as MIT, take jobs at aviation firms, and the most important of these...
Where have we seen this before?
Oh boy, huh? China's learned a lot. The most important of these agents, Stanislav Shimovsky, codenamed Beliro, would remain in the United States for over a decade, overseeing a spying operation so successful that by the mid-1930s, his men had placed agents or recruited sources from all main U.S. aviation firms, from the Douglas plant in Southern California, manufacturer of the DC series of huge dual-engine passenger planes, transports, and bombers, to Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York, a leader in fighter design, to Wright Aeronautical in Paterson, New Jersey, the largest manufacturer of aero engines in the entire world, world. Shimvalsky became even more brazen the longer he stayed, escorting Andrei Tupolev, Sergei Ilyushin, and Pavel Sukhoi, three of Stalin's top military aircraft designers, around dozen American universities, research labs, and aviation plants, allowing them to reverse engineer American fighters, light bombers, and transport planes into Soviet versions. Those three guys are some of the most well-known Russian aircraft designers in the world.
Their aircraft even today are still named after them.
Yeah. And we let them in. We let them in. And we didn't do anything. Those three men still have names. Yeah, like you said, there are still planes today, long after they're dead, that still bear their namesake because of how, world breaking and groundbreaking their designs were. Tupolev's designs would be vital to the war effort. I mean, all three of them would. And I mean, these guys were some of the top in the world that America would then have to compete with after the war and during the war. You don't hate the American naivete enough. You just don't. You don't. While many of Stalin's new factories and his focus on the aircraft did not meet production targets, along with his industrialization failures, for which a series of industrial and agricultural wreckers were scapegoated and put on trial, the growth trend line from 1929 onward was solid in aggregate, ramping up even more dramatically every year. So powerful was the whiff of progress that thousands of Americans thrown out of work of the Great Depression voluntarily immigrated to the USSR in the early 1930s, enticed by the promise of Stalin's supposed workers' paradise, or at least by the full employment of the allegedly produced by a rapidly industrializing planned economy. Still, there remained a thorny problem. The real goal of Stalin's 5-year plan was to mass manufacture modern military hardware. In September 1930, Marshal M.N. Tukhachevsky, a hero of the Russian Civil War and Stalin's foremost military planner, stated that a modern military would require annual production of 50,000 tanks and 40,000 warplanes. And yet, as suggested by his hiring of Americans to design and run his factories and dispatch his spies to American universities and aviation firms in 1931, Stalin remained at the mercy of the capitalist world he hoped desperately to overcome. Relations with Western powers were still frosty. Despite cooperation born of the Rapallo Agreement in 1922, German firms had soured on Russia after a series of Soviet defaults. The firm mostly heavily involved in the Rapallo arms trade, Junkers, had gone bankrupt in 1925. Moreover, after Hitler came to power in January 1933, and particularly after his government blamed and cracked down on German communists for the Reichstag fire in that February, the Germans could not really be trusted. Industrial espionage could help Soviet engineers and aircraft designers, but only up to a point. In order to modernize the armies of communism, it might be necessary to strike a deal with the capitalist devils in the United States of America. And when do we recognize the Soviet Union, ladies and gentlemen? We recognize them in 1933.
Right on time.
Right on time and right on cue, because that's our next chapter.
Yes, but I mean, just to cap off that last chapter, I mean, you think it doesn't get worse? It gets worse.
Yeah, it gets worse. There are no words to describe how over it really was before it even began. And I just think about that line from Kovefe and on Twitter. It's just like, look, the communists won. And this book is going to tell you it was kind of over before it began, and how much we did to aid Stalin, whether deliberately or inadvertently, cannot be understated. So, Section 3 of Chapter 1, Strategic Coup in Washington. Despite winning recognition from most European and Asian powers, the USSR diplomatic position remained precarious in the early 1930s. Some of the countries that had taken the lead in recognizing Moscow later reversed course. After opening relations in 1924, the British severed them in 1927 in retaliation for communist meddling in British domestic politics. So too had China broken off relations from after an egregious Soviet interference from the country's internal affairs in the form of the violent Communist Canton uprising of 1927. Mexico bravely resisted diplomatic pressure from Washington by recognizing the Soviets in 1924 and made headlines again in 1926 with Stalin's appointment of the world's first ever female ambassador to Mexico City, but later broke off relations with Moscow in 1930 over ideological differences.
People don't think communism was gay. People don't think it wasn't paused. It was paused.
It was bad. Japan had recognized the USSR in 1925, but the invasion of Manchuria in September 1931 threw relations with Moscow into a deep freeze, with both sides heavily arming along the Siberia-Manchurian border. Japan's ambassador to the USSR wrote to Tokyo in a message intercepted by Soviet intelligence that Japan must be ready to declare a war at any moment and adopt a tough policy towards the Soviet Union. As Stalin told his advisors in June 1932, the Japanese are certainly preparing for war against the USSR, and we have to be ready for anything. The most important diplomatic holdout was the United States. It had not escaped Stalin's attention that Americans and Japanese troops had intervened against the Red Army in Siberia in 1918 and 1919, or that relations between the two powers had become increasingly strained. The Japanese statesmen resented the construction limits for capital ships, battleships, and cruisers dictated by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which imposed a tonnage ratio of 3 to 5 for Japan against both the United States and Britain. The U.S. Immigration Act of 1924 had barred Japanese nationals, along with other Asians, from immigrating to America on racial grounds, an obvious insult. American officials led the way in condemning the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, now styled as Manchukuo, by the occupiers. The U.S. Secretary of State Henry Stimson fumed against the aggressive act by Japan. In the view of growing antipathy between Washington and Tokyo, the prospect of American recognition of the USSR took on geopolitical importance. Although Russian moves in the Far East garnered little international attention, the truth was that the Soviets, despite their anti-imperialist rhetoric, were no less active interventionists in China than the Japanese. In 1926, the Red Army troops had occupied the Tanautuva, an area north of northwest Mongolia, almost as large as Britain, that had belonged to China since the early 18th century, to seize its plentiful gold mines. It remains Russian territory to this day.
Remember what I said about the gold. There's a reason why they're seizing that gold. And I don't think I'm wrong on that assertion. I think that's very clear.
People will take a more stable currency, and gold is still valuable to this day. I don't think that that's a terrible assumption at all. The botched Soviet-supported Canton Uprising of 1927 was an outrage to Chinese nationalists. In 1929, after rejecting a Chinese request to evacuate Manchuria, Stalin deployed nearly 100,000 Soviet troops to secure the Chinese Eastern Railway there. After the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the Red Army remained poised at the border for years, ready to reinvade if Moscow sensed weakness from Japan. Consistent with this pattern of imperialist opportunism in China, in January 1932, Stalin cynically offered to sell the Chinese Eastern Railway to the Japanese Manchukuo over Chinese objections. Japan said no. With an eye on the tense situation in Manchuria, Secretary of State Stimson commissioned a study of the pros and cons of U.S. recognition of the Soviet Union by the Far Eastern Division of the State Department in spring 1932. Interestingly, Stimson concluded that the recognition of Communist Russia during the ongoing Manchurian crisis was undesirable precisely because, quote, the whole world, and particularly Japan, would jump to the conclusion that our action had been dictated solely by political expedience as a maneuver to bring forceful pressure upon Japan. And I'm going to rotate this page real quick so we can look at it better. So this is Soviet Union, Northeastern China, Manchuria, Korea, Japan, 1931. So this is what we're dealing with here. Manchuria, the rest of China, Mongolia, the Soviet Union, and then, of course, Japan. Kind of an important thing to consider here. This is, of course, part of the Sino-Japanese War that plays out throughout the 1930s and continues on later throughout the Second World War. And, this is why the United States, after, the discussion of what to do with Japan after Nazi Germany fell, and the Soviets were like, we'll just declare a war. No, we do not want you to declare a war. We do not want you getting any more territory than you already have. Harry Truman had at least some sense of mind on him. But maps are always good to have, and this is an important thing to consider. So back to normal reading, I think, now. The lack of recognition restricted Soviet access to American capital. Many American firms and engineers had taken on commissions in the Soviet economy, but these deals were all done under the table, financed on the fly by Soviet gold exports and illicit Soviet sales of artwork and antiquities in European and American auction houses. But the deepening of the Depression after 1931 severely dented the Soviet art laundering business, coupled with a Japanese threat in Manchuria and the galloping anti communism of Germany after Hitler came to power. The pinch in Soviet art sales left Moscow low on foreign reserves. So desperate was Stalin for outside support, he signed a non aggression pact with Mussolini's fascist Italy in 1933. This is sort of an anecdote, but Soviet sales of artwork and antiquity in American auction houses. In my church, there's an icon written of Christ that was done in like the 1840s, and even the founders of my parish were like, some guy just came here, said he was from Russia, dropped it off. We've never seen him again. We have no idea how this got into the country, but it's in the church now, and it just makes you wonder how much of that stuff, pilfered by churches and religious houses and monastics, made their way into Europe and other parts of America just simply by ending up in auction houses or people taking it with them as they fled. But it doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
There's an interesting question I have. There's another anecdote later in the book that I've recounted to others about the German art that was stolen by the Soviet Union. And this is a consistent pattern as well. Anything that can be stolen and sold off at a higher price than they got it for is something that they're going to take with them. But I did make a note of the footnote that McMeekin has for this section, because some of the right-wing Anon sphere might be interested to read the sources that he lists here. And he says, the classic study of the illicit Soviet art dumping trade remains Robert C. Williams, Russian Art and American Money, 1900 to 1940, although a number of recent works have expanded on his findings. See, for example, Anne Odom and Wendy R. Salmond, Treasure into Tractors, the Selling of Russia's Cultural Heritage, 1918 to 1938. And he also cites his own, this is McMeekin's, History's Greatest Heist, and he's citing the epilogue for that book. So if anybody wants to get more detail about the amount and type of things that get stolen, those would be sources you could look into.
Yeah, and those, I just put them up on screen for a moment just now. I only read his book on the Russian Revolution, which was like really good. I would really recommend, if you want to understand the rise of the Soviet Union, McMeekin's book I would recommend to people. And there are other great books as well, but McMeekin's got a good book on it. He's also got a lot of great work on just how bad the diplomacy of the lead up to World War I was, because it was such a cock up that McMeekin argues is just a human tragedy, because it could have been avoided if communication was not done by horse, but rather by telegraph wire. But that's a talk for another time. A glimmer of hope for Stalin had appeared in Washington when the presidential inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt on March 4th, 1933. Roosevelt, despite dropping hints, made no firm commitment to recognize Russia during an election campaign that had focused mostly on domestic economic issues. There was still the mere fact that Roosevelt had won, and decisively at 472 to 59 of the Electoral College. Winning all but 6 states was significant. Following 12 years in the political wilderness under Republican presidents, Democrats were primed to shake things up in Washington. The nadir of the Great Depression, which hit the United States in the months preceding FDR's inauguration, produced a compelling mandate for change. Nonetheless, Roosevelt needed to tread carefully. While the handful of American industrialists who had signed concessions with Soviet Russia, along with most Democratic and pro-Roosevelt media organizations like the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, tended to favor recognition, most Republicans and the conservative press, notably the Chicago Tribune, remained opposed, lending the issue as a partisan air that did not appeal to a president-elect trying to broaden his coalition. The outgoing president, Herbert Hoover, warned Roosevelt of the Moscow counterfeiting of millions of dollars in American currency, an operation exposed in the New York Times on February 24th, 1933. Most State Department professionals remained wary of Stalin. As the head of the Eastern European Division, Robert F. Kelly pointed out to Roosevelt on July 27, 1933, so long as the communist regime continues to carry on in other countries activities designed to bring about the overthrow of government and institutions of these countries, the establishment of genuinely friendly relations between the Russia and those countries is out of the question. End quote. Before considering recognition, Kelly argued the United States must demand the abandonment by Moscow of the direction, supervision, control, financing, etc., through every agency utilized for the purpose of communist and other related activities in the United States. Again, one of the only few sane people that you're going to hear from today, outside of maybe George F. Kennan at the time, who is a Foreign Service officer.
Yeah, these are all basic requirements that should have been, implemented, but of course, none of this is, and like it's just such incredibly small things. But and of course, as we'll get to later, they'll get non-binding agreements with the Soviets or that sort of thing. But of course, Stalin isn't going to abide by these things, and I sincerely doubt that, given what we've already seen from the ideological perspective of Soviet communism, Stalin isn't going to abide by any of these agreements. He's required to create the world revolution, by his ideology. So even if he enters into an agreement that's binding, I doubt that he'll abide by any of that.
Yeah, and I mean, like the previous chapters have laid this out very clearly that the Soviets will say something if it suits them, or if they're too weak to do anything. But after taking advantage of under the deal tables, importing American workers and expertise, and spying on them, there's no way that they would say yes to this, but still do exactly what they've been doing. And as history tells us, they do just that. We'll lay off and then proceed to spy in and take part in every major academic, industrial, and political institution in the United States when it comes to the left. Refraining from Comintern-directed revolutionary agitation was, or should have been, those are what might have been, should have been. Sad words. Only the first essential precondition for the recognition of the Soviet Union. As Kelly reminded Roosevelt, there was also the lack of repudiated debts and confiscated property dating back to the Bolshevik default of 1918. The American share of the annulled Russian state loans alone amounted to $298 million in principal, not including the interest or inflation adjustment, of which $192,601,297 was owed to the United States government, and another $106,884,157 owed to private American citizens. American-owned property nationalized, that is, confiscated by the Bolsheviks, made up another $336,691,771. Damn, it's a lot of money. And this is 1933 money. This isn't today's money. A conservative estimate thus puts Soviet obligations of the expropriated American property of bondholders circa 1933 well over $600 million in principal, the equivalent perhaps of $60 billion today. Aside from the moral imperative of recovering some of these losses for the Americans at a time of crippling economic hardship and suffering, Kelly reminded President Roosevelt that the government of the United States has a profound interest in the maintenance of the sanctity of international obligations.
Just what liberal nonsense! Oh my god. I mean, but this is interesting. Also, like I mentioned before, this is an unstudied area of history, because this is in the Bolshevik default of 1918, right? How much of the world economy and the downturn post World War I is because you have massive amounts of money that's being expropriated, and all of the czarist debts are being declined to be paid, essentially, by the Soviets. Like, it makes me wonder, right? Because it really does make you wonder how deep all of this stuff is in terms of like creating the conditions for future revolution by creating economic downturn, like deliberately. I mean, not even necessarily deliberately, but this is like the ideology is like helping itself perpetuate.
Just no words. Really, no words here. Of course, it was unrealistic to expect American bondholders to get full value on the dollar. Nonetheless, the recognition question gave Roosevelt substantial leverage, as Soviet diplomats realized. While Russian estimates of American losses in the defaults were lower than Kelly's, the Soviet Affairs Commissar Maxim Litvinov was willing to concede in a memorandum circulated to the Politburo 284 million in defaulted state loans, 60.5 million in expropriated property, which might justify an American claim, including 15 years of interest of about $500 million. It was not that Stalin wanted to pay the sum, rather, Litvinov wanted Soviet diplomats to be prepared for what he expected would be Roosevelt's baseline demand.
So
Litvinov,
this
yeah,
is
go
this
ahead.
is like the bottom figure that Stalin is like, okay, we know that we owe this much. Basically, the capitalists are going to demand this much money of us, right? So that's what he's saying. This is what we actually owe 600 million, right, circa 1933, but this is what we could probably, expect for their lowest demand, the Americans' lowest demand would be. But it's not, as we'll get into.
Yeah, no. We'll just see how it goes. Litvinov needed not to have fretted so much. In a replay of the dynamic behind the Anglo-Soviet trade agreement of 1921, Roosevelt was blinded by the chimera of economic stimulus, thinking that the Soviet Union would provide a major new export market for American firms. As he boasted to his Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, yes, that Morgenthau, if I could only myself talk to some one man representing the Russians, I could straighten out this whole question. In Roosevelt's mind, all it would take was the right meeting in order to break the ice between the two countries, and that way would gradually get the people of the United States used to doing business with Russia. Like Lloyd George and oh, go ahead.
I'm just this comment. I have a note written in the margins of my book, and I just wrote, "What a shitlib, so fucking naive."
Oh, gee, just with a firm handshake, and if I just start to just meet the right man, everything will be fine.
We can resolve everything through dialogue. Everything can be talked over.
We can just talk this through like two sane men. Gee, George, I don't know how it's going to work. Like Lloyd George in 1921, Roosevelt mistakenly believed that irrational political tensions were holding up the Russian imports of American goods, rather than the more prosaic explanation that communism had impoverished Russia, that the Soviets had limited means to pay for them. There were plenty of American firms already operating in Russia. The Soviet demand for U.S. technology was almost insatiable. What the Soviets were after, as Morgenthau explained to Roosevelt, was access to the U.S. bond market to obtain large loans to enable substantial purchases of American raw materials and industrial inputs. The real issue in 1933 was not breaking the ice, but deciding whether or not to demand a serious quid pro quo exchange for the recognition of Stalin's tyrannical regime for extending it to new loans. All the leverage, in other words, was enjoyed by the United States. The Soviets desired recognition to win international prestige, enhance legal Western capital, and to open new embassies and consulates offering legal protections for Soviet agents and communists operating in North America. By contrast, U.S. firms had already accessed the Soviet market, limited but only by the ability of the Soviets to pay. Any new loans to Stalin that the U.S. government could guarantee might stimulate demand for U.S. exports, but they would also come with a substantial risk of default based on a clear pattern of Soviet behavior going back to 1918. There were more serious risks, too, evident in the record of communist subversion of countries that had allowed Soviet agents to operate out of embassies, such as Germany, Britain, and China. The advantages of recognition were so lopsided in Stalin's favor that Roosevelt could have set terms as steep as he liked, demanding repayment of the entire $600 million in lost principal, along with ironclad guarantees that the Soviet government would cease subsidizing the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, and other agents on U.S. soil. Litvinov came to Washington in November 1933, pleading for recognition, fully expecting that he would have to agree to repay, if not the $500 million he expected to Roosevelt to ask for, then at the very end, a substantial sum of money.
Yeah,
Roosevelt.
say what you want about Henry Morgenthau. He's not a moron. Like this is the one time where Roosevelt is actually getting halfway decent advice. Like Morgenthau actually knows what he's talking about here. He's like, no, like you got the Soviets over a barrel, man. The Soviets are what they're looking for is not, you know, recognition. What they're looking for is access to more money, right? Because they want access to the bond market to get more private loans from the United States, and everybody has seen the pattern. Okay, we've run through all of the Tsarist money. We've gotten through all of the German money, all of the German loans. We've also refused to pay. We've got all of this other expropriated cash that we've burned through. We've now we're now engaging in our program of industrialization, and we're starving our own population by expropriating the grain and selling it abroad and using that money. And but we also need a little bit more money. So yeah, this is why he's looking for access. That was absolutely correct. That's what Stalin's looking for here.
Yeah. Roosevelt, alas, did not have any idea how much leverage he enjoyed. Remarkably, his opening bid was not $600 million, nor the $500 million Litvinov expected, but $150 million, a mere fourth of the principal owed, and even that, he let Litvinov know, was not so much his own claim, but the smallest sum he could persuade Congress to accept.
It's not even 150 million.
No, it's not. With the president signaling that he thought $150 million was unreasonable, it was an easy trick for Litvinov to barter him down to a non-committal figure between $75 and $150 million. With chutzpah, Litvinov was then commissioned a study by the Soviet Ministry of Finance on Tsarist assets seized inside the United States in retaliation for the 1918 default, coughing up the figure to $243 million, which, after being adjusted for interest, allowed Litvinov to issue a counterclaim for $161 million. If accepted, it would nullify FDR's own watered-down claim entirely.
No, actually, you owe us money.
Oh, I only just called it even. Oh, Jesus wept. To twist the knife in, Stalin invited the New York Times correspondent to Moscow, Walter Duranty, the most notorious among more honest foreign journalists, for his blanket denials of the Ukrainian. Man, if you don't hate these people more, if you don't hate them more after this, I don't know what to tell you. Blanket denials of the Ukrainian famine earlier that year to the Kremlin for a sympathetic Christmas Day interview. With sycophancy impressive even by his own abysmal standards, Duranty neglected to ask a single question about Soviet obligations to deposed American bondholders, instead lofting Stalin's softballs such as, what do you think is the potential for Soviet-American trade? And how much can you reassure foreign creditors about Soviet means to repay? Stalin nearly slipped here, admitting that the Soviets had defaulted on German loans, but he claimed that this was not relevant, as we are no longer dependent on German industry, but can manufacture our own equipment now. And
that's totally missing the fucking point. They're not asking if you have industry.
You don't
They're
hate journalists enough. You don't hate journalists.
They don't have fucking money because they're commies. That's the point. Oh my God.
You don't hate journalists enough.
No.
You really don't. An intelligent interviewer would have probed here to learn why, if the Soviets really no longer needed foreign imports or technology to transfers for Stalin's industrialization drive, then why were they so keen on securing American recognition and new loans from Wall Street? Instead, Duranty meekly asked, so what is your opinion of America? Reeling in his target with flattery, Stalin replied that with the new president was a decisive and masculine leader. FDR gets cucked and sends people to die on the front in World War II. But yeah, sure. By the time Litvinov and Stalin were done manipulating him, Roosevelt had agreed to reduce U.S. claims after subtracting Soviet claims of compensation for seized Tsarist assets to a mere $75 million. Even this was a modest sum, and a trick the Germans were now painfully familiar with, would not be paid off immediately, but rather a rolling installment plan via excessive interests due to a new $200 million U.S. government guaranteed loan from the Import-Export Bank to Moscow, payable over 20 or 25 years. Rather than secure relief for American investors and bondholders robbed blind by the Bolsheviks at a time of great economic hardships, Roosevelt had promised Stalin a vast store of ready American capital, which would allow him to resume his rearmament drive to full blast.
All right, stop. I have the footnote highlighted here.
Here it is on screen.
Excellent. Okay, well, let me find it in my book. So there we go. The idea was that instead of paying the prevailing market rate of 3 to 4% for a sovereign loan that size, the Soviets would instead pay 8%. Whatever the Americans believed they had negotiated, this deal of $75 million for recognition, payable via future loan interest, is what Litvinov and Stalin agreed to in exchange for recognition. And he goes on, in April 1934, Bullitt, this gentleman Bullitt, reported to Washington that prior to any prospective Soviet agreement to pay anything at all, the Export-Import Bank would have to open a credit for Stalin of $150 million if the agreed debt claim was $75 million, or $200 million if it was $100 million. This is from his Bullitt's to diplomatic papers in April 2nd, 1934. So the entire point of this is basically Stalin is paying $75 million. He's paying it with interest over 20 to 25 years. That's going to get extended out into the future because the communists don't want to pay anything. But he's getting access to American loan capital of $150 to $200 million. So really, he's not actually paying. He's actually getting free money. That's the point.
Like there's no. This is all to Stalin's benefit. Like, we're not going to pay this back. We're going to get access to your loans. I'm spying on you, and I'm going to industrialize using your own capital, loans, and expertise. Fuck you. Like,
yeah. He's just a total fucking gangster. Like, just an absolute swindler. And Roosevelt is such a moron. Like, just...
There are no words. No words.
There's no words for how stupid and naive he is. I mean, you wonder, the saying, what is that word? You don't attribute to malice what can be attributed to incompetence. I mean, these are Roosevelt's decisions, and as we'll see later, I mean, this is not just because of his decisions. He's also receiving advice from trusted advisors who are obviously like sympathetic to Soviet communism. But anyway.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It helps to explain Roosevelt's decision-making process here.
Yeah. The only demands the president's negotiating team, headed by Henry Morgenthau, levied in exchange for the diplomatic recognition they granted to the USSR on November 16th, 1933, was the non-binding promise to pay off old debts via a large new loan, a vague understanding that the Soviets use this loan purchase of American products to a non-binding promise to refrain. Non-binding promises.
Non-binding.
Non-binding. To refrain from interfering in any manner with the internal affairs of the United States, except for the Soviet promise to buy U.S. wares with the import-export credits, that is, to enjoy the privilege of importing desperately needed goods with no cash down. There was never any intention on Stalin's part of being true to the letter of Litvinov's carefully worded declarations. Soviet officials haggled for months over repayment terms on the United States loans, threatening to place orders in Europe instead of the United States if the interest rates were not reduced. As late as May 1935, the Soviets were still insisting on easy terms and a 20-year loan while promising nothing about paying old debts. Although they succeeded in burying American debt claims, the Soviets did not get everything they wanted. Negotiations over Russian debt repayment and new American loans were mooted when Congress enacted the Johnson Act on April 13th, 1934, which prohibited foreign nations to default from marketing their bonds in U.S. markets. This law remains in force today. Instead of establishing mutual trust, the financial impasse helped poison U.S.-Soviet diplomatic relations from the start. As Roosevelt's first ambassador to the USSR, William Bullitt, informed the president soon after arriving in Moscow that April, the honeymoon atmosphere has evaporated completely before I arrived. Their underlying hostility to all capitalist countries now shows through the veneer of intimate friendship. Litvinov and Stalin also did not obtain a binding agreement from Roosevelt on Japan, which helped explain why Bullitt received such a cold welcome in Moscow. At one point, Litvinov had asked Roosevelt what he had thought of an agreement between the Soviet Union on joint action in the event of a danger to peace, only to be put off. But Litvinov's coup in Washington did allow the USSR to escape diplomatic isolation at a dangerous time. Although Stalin crowed that U.S. recognition was an act the most serious significance for the international system, it did not entail bilateral security cooperation against the Japanese in Asia, if that was what the Soviets wanted. Bullitt reported to Roosevelt on April 24th, 1934, the Russians are convinced that Japan will not attack this spring or summer, thus they no longer feel the need that they need our immediate help. As for Litvinov's pie crust promise to refrain from interfering in American politics, this was immediately broken. Surprise, surprise. According to the American communist D.H. Dabrowski, Litvinov arrived at the CPUSA meeting after leaving the White House. November 1933. All smiles stated, "It is all well in the bag. We have it. They wanted us to recognize the old debts that we owed them, and I promised we were going to negotiate. But they did not know we were going to negotiate until doomsday." Just imagine just the absolute swagger of the Soviet foreign statesman to walk to the CPUSA party meeting right after leaving the White House to say, "Yeah, we duped these fucks." You know,
Yeah,
unbelievable.
just imagine how big your balls must be after that meeting. I mean, God.
Oh,
He's like the Randy Marsh meme. He's just like walking around with him in like a wheelbarrow or
yeah, he's
something.
carrying him in a wheelbarrow. He leaves the White House only to go to the communists in America and being like, "Listen, buddy, we got such a big W. Unbelievable, you know." Oh my god.
It's the most unbelievable win. It's the greatest win of all time ever.
This is the greatest trade deal in the history of trade deals. Litvinov's pledge to not interfere in U.S. domestic affairs, he informed CPUSA leaders, did not bind the party, but only the Soviet government, and was anyhow a scrap of paper which will soon be forgotten in the realities of Soviet-American relations. Given a green light by Litvinov, the CPUSA published a statement reaffirming its commitment to revolutionary principles in the New York Times, November 19th, 1933. Oh, man. Litvinov just told Roosevelt to get fucked.
Yep.
This was no idle threat in the years after Roosevelt recognized the USSR. Dozens of Soviet agents and CPUSA members infiltrated the US government, helped along by the vigorous and now almost entirely unvetted bureaucratic expansion of FDR's New Deal. You don't hate FDR enough. You don't hate FDR enough. You don't hate FDR enough. Key targets for the infiltration included the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, where Communist Cell ran by Harold Ware provided entree for notorious Soviet agents such as Whittaker Chambers, Elizabeth Bentley, and Nathan Silvermaster. Ware, although American-born, had lived in Soviet Russia in the early 1920s, overseeing an experiment in mechanized collectivist agriculture. Russian peasants mostly remembered him chasing them around threateningly with a baseball bat. Communists also infiltrated the Works Progress Administration, the National Labor Relations Board, and the Justice Department. The State Department, meanwhile, was honeycombed with Soviet agents such as Lawrence Duggan, codenamed Frank, and Michael Straight, Nigel, and most famously, Alger Hiss.
Oh, you mean the State Department is filled with commies? Really?
Really? Really? And it all started with the expansion of the FDR and the administrative state that we still deal with today? Huh. These are the managers? The managers, the managerial revolution? The ones that Burnham talked about? Say it ain't so.
They're all commies? All the way down?
All the way down? Joe McCarthy did nothing wrong? Anyways. The communist penetration of the FDR administration after 1933 is noteworthy because the public line of the CPUSA was harshly critical of the New Deal, suggesting that it was not enthusiasm for the president's policies that motivated communists to work for him. In July 1933, the CPUSA head Earl Browder publicly denounced FDR's Industrial Recovery Act as the Industrial Slavery Act, and the Labor Union Legalizing Wagner Act as Roosevelt's company union club against the workers. The CPUSA's annual May Day manifesto of 1934, in accordance with the Comintern doctrine that socialists were the real fascists, denounced Roosevelt to a New Deal fascism and war.
Well, yeah, I mean, they might not be entirely wrong if you look at some of FDR's like Art Deco aesthetics and shit of the period, but
well,
yeah,
our Art Deco is based. I don't care what anyone says. I like Art Deco, but
yeah, so do I.
the most
But
left-wing president in the history of the United States, maybe
it's
outside,
still not left
is a
wing enough.
fascist. Is a fascist.
It's a fascist to these people.
There's no negotiating with these people, you know? There's no negotiating with communists. They want you dead. The only kind response is to do it first.
Yeah, but anyway, this is just public denunciation, covert infiltration, right? They don't really hate FDR
No.
as much as they say. They're just, this is all, public disciplinary and kayfabe.
He's not left-wing enough.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Okay. Let's continue. Recognizing the Soviet Union in 1933 was not enough for Roosevelt to escape this kind of vituperation until American communists received instructions from Moscow to cease abusing him after Stalin's new Popular Front doctrine, which instructed communists to stop attacking socialists and cooperate with them, was promulgated in October 1920. And the footnote for this one says...
October 1935.
Oh, 35, excuse me. Citations in Gitlow, whole of their lives. That might be a fun one to read. The best part of great history tomes like this are the footnotes. What drove communist penetration of the United States government in the mid-1930s was not ideological affinity, at least until Stalin's doctrinal about-face in 1935, but Soviet opportunism, enabled by the Roosevelt administration's lax security. The most critical factor was the stamp of legitimacy the president had placed on the USSR by recognizing Stalin's regime, which removed the stigma from Communist Party membership. Between recognition in 1933 and 1938, the ranks of card-carrying Communist Party members of the United States of America exploded from 13,000 to over 80,000 members. A large part of the reason why there were so many communists in the American government by the late 1930s was simply that there were so many more communists around to draw on. I'm a New Deal Democrat, as Oppenheimer would say. By sheer critical mass, the CPUSA members were now able to throw their weight around in Washington. Cited in Hoover, Freedom Betrayed, on Roosevelt administration's refusal to vet employees for foreign loyalties. See Andrew Metrotkin, Sword and Shield, page 107. Freedom Betrayed. I wonder if that's written by...
That Sword and Shield book is interesting, too. I did check the footnotes with that one, and that one's like a KGB archival memoir or some such document, if I remember correctly. That sounds very interesting. Because it's from the Soviet side of it.
Yeah, and Freedom Betrayed is George Nash, another. I think he's with the Hoover Institute, and he's it's called Herbert Hoover's Secret History of the Second World War and Its Aftermath. So edited with an introduction by George H. Nash. So this is actually, I think, just Herbert Hoover's work. Yeah, last published nearly 50 years after its completion. So I would love to read that next. That might be a good book to cover. More important than all these party members put together was the rise of sympathizing agents of the influence into its upper reaches of the Roosevelt administration. Among these were Hiss, who whisked up from Harold Ware's cell in the AAA in 1933 to the Senate Committee investigating the munitions industry, 1934, to the Office of the Solicitor General, 1934 to 1936, and finally the Office of Special Political Affairs on the State Department, 1936 to 1947. You had a communist sympathizer there in the special political affairs operations of the U.S. State Department throughout the entirety of World War II, where he had access to classified material relating to U.S. military strategy and substantial influence over policy. Although Hiss had plenty of defenders against the charges of espionage laid against him by Elizabeth Bettany and Whittaker Chambers after the war, Hiss was sentenced for perjury in 1950. Decrypted Soviet telegrams, the Venona files, were released to the public in the 1990s, had confirmed... Venona had confirmed that Hiss was closely collaborated with Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, even if he never joined the CPUSA. You don't have to be a card-carrying communist to be a traitor.
This is true. And there's benefits to being a sympathizer and not actually being a card-carrying member, right? This is, this is more of Harry Dexter White stuff, but if you're an informant, if you're working, hand in glove with these people, it's actually more beneficial for you to not be a physical card carrying member, right? Because, well, I can't be accused of it. I was never a member of that organization. I'm not a communist. I'm a New Deal Democrat. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm a New Deal Democrat. Nothing else. More highly placed still was Harry Dexter White, a Harvard-educated economist who worked for the Treasury Department in 1934 and rose to rapidly become the right-hand man of Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt's powerful Secretary of Treasury. Venona decrypts show that White began to work for the GRU as early as 1935 under the Soviet spy code named Kassir, later changed to Jurist, reporting initially to CPUSA members, Whittaker Chambers and Nathan Silvermaster, and later directly to Soviet functionaries working for the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, the NKVD, including the successive Washington NKVD bureau chiefs Isaac Akamerov, Boris Barazov, and Vitaly Pavlov. Although White's motivation for spying remains unclear, however, he was sympathetic to communism. He appears to have never joined the CPUSA, and there's no longer any doubt that White regularly met with Soviet agents and shared sensitive information with them. In addition to the Venona decrypts, Pavlov later published a tell-all memoir about his works with Harry Dexter White.
Well, I would say White equals Weiss, and that's the real motivation of why he's doing what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there to break down, and you really do begin to see as you're working with Henry Morgenthau and others the desire to go as hard as you can and focus on Germany and not focus on the Soviet Union, which towards the end of the war is clearly the much bigger threat to the West than a battered on both sides, firebombed, and deindustrialized Germany. But here we are. By the end of the 1930s, there were hundreds of paid Soviet agents working inside the U.S. government, either 221 according to contemporary Soviet records or 329 according to the Venona decrypts, from the Department of Agriculture and State to the Treasury and the U.S. Army. There were then 75 plus spies and informants working under Stalin's spy leader, Shumovsky, who stepped up his activities still further after the U.S. recognition of the Soviet Union allowed many Soviet nationals to operate perfectly legal under diplomatic cover. In 1935, Shumovsky brought a team of Soviet aviation experts large enough to occupy 7 cars, led by Stalin's most brilliant aircraft designer, Andrei Tupolev, on an open buying expedition of U.S. aviation factories. Stalin gave Tupolev $600,000 to spend as he saw fit. Shumovsky's penetration of U.S. aviation was so thorough that by 1938, a disgruntled American aeronautical engineer informed the U.S. air attaché in London that the Russian government has agents in practically all American aircraft factories. There were hundreds more soft sympathizers like Hiss and White, placed highly enough to directly shape policies that affected the USSR, from technology transfer and the bilateral trade protocols with the U.S. relations to Japan, whose Kwantung army operated Manchuria. Stalin's regime remained in the state undeclared hostilities throughout the 1930s. A Soviet espionage ring in Tokyo led by Richard Sorge, codenamed Ramsey, a German correspondent from the Frankfurter Zeitung, whose posed as a vociferously anti-communist Nazi, gave him entree into both German embassy and the Japanese government, furnished Stalin with invaluable intelligence about Japanese intentions vis-a-vis the Soviet Far East and the United States. As Whittaker Chambers' Soviet handler reported proudly to Moscow, "We have agents at the very center of government influencing policy." The Soviet embassy of Washington was a critical strategic foothold for Stalin as he prepared his communist empire for war. Unbelievable.
There you have it, folks. You have the Reds really were under the bed.
Yeah,
and it really goes to show you that you don't need that many people, right? I mean, these conflicting figures, right? Okay, so you have the 221 from contemporary records, and then 329 according to the Venona decrypts. Well, just because you have that doesn't mean that there's that much of a difference, right? That's a difference of 100 people. And how many of these people are like extremely top secret operatives, right? Who are like, the 221 is just the people that you've got logged on paper, like, hey, we know this guy is doing stuff for us. That's not the most secret of secret people, where if like the ultra top secret people get outed, that is going to destroy their position in government. Like, so the reason I would imagine people like Harry Dexter White and people like Alger Hiss are probably not logged in the contemporary Soviet records, which is why they're logged in the Venona decrypts, because these are people who are so high up in the FDR administration that if you can't afford to have their names or their code names on paper that gets widely disseminated, that's like for Stalin's eyes only, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm a little pressed for time, so I think we'll wrap it up here, and we'll probably finish section 4 of chapter 1 at another time. We've been going for almost 2 hours now. Mr. Raging Mandrill, where can people find you and your work?
You can find me on my own channel. At Edgy Mandrill is the tag. That's the same Twitter on Twitter. So you can follow me there as well. I'm on Gab. You can find me in random chat rooms on Telegram. I do have a Substack of my own, and I do write pretty substantially for the Old Glory Club on their Substack. And of course, you can also check me out on Thursdays, sometimes with the Old Glory Club's Pony Express show. So by all means, go check me out in those places.
And we'll be continuing on with Stalin's War. Probably Mr. Mandrill will come back as a recurring guest as we go throughout the entirety of this book. I do have plans to hopefully have Martin on, along with a few others that have read this book. This text itself, I don't think, can be understated in recognizing how much of an impact the Soviets had on American policy and how ruthless Stalin was, both in conducting his war, but also even prior to the Second World War, as we've just covered in this chapter. This will be available for patrons throughout the weekend, and it will be released to the public on the main channel this coming Tuesday, November 7th. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for your time, and thank you for joining me as we begin our deep dive reading and journey through Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin. We'll see you all next time.